Chicago in 1835. A comprehensive historical overview. Chapter 1. The Physical Place. A frontier settlement in the mud. The tiny town on the prairie. In the year 1835, Chicago was not a city at all. It was a raw, muddy, barely organized frontier settlement of approximately 3,500 souls clinging to the swampy shores of Lake Michigan. Just 2 years had passed since Chicago had been incorporated as a town in 1833. The incorporation as a city was still 2 years in the future. That would come in 1837. What existed in 1835 was something between a village and an ambition, a place that seemed to consist more of dreams and speculation than of actual buildings. The settlement occupied a peculiar landscape where the sluggish Chicago River met the vast expanse of Lake Michigan. This was not promising terrain for a city. The land was flat, barely rising above the level of the lake. Marshes and wetlands surrounded the settlement, breeding mosquitoes that brought malaria to a substantial portion of the population. When it rained, the unpaved streets became impassable rivers of mud. When it was dry, dust choked everything. The smell of the marshes, the livestock, and the inadequate sanitation created an olfactory experience that newcomers found overwhelming. Yet people kept coming. Word had spread that this spot, this unpromising, muddy, fever-ridden spot, was destined for greatness. The geography that made daily life so difficult also made Chicago strategically important. The portage connecting the Great Lakes to the Mississippi River system was just miles away. Whoever controlled this location controlled a continental crossroads. Speculators, dreamers, and desperate seekers of fortune were arriving by the hundreds, convinced that they were getting in on the ground floor of something enormous. The transformation from wilderness to settlement had happened with stunning speed. Just 3 years earlier, in 1832, the Black Hawk War had terrified settlers throughout the region. Just 2 years earlier, the Treaty of Chicago had forced the Potawatomi to cede their lands and prepare for removal westward. The Native American presence that had defined this place for thousands of years was disappearing. What would replace it was still being invented. The Chicago River. The Chicago River was the settlement's defining feature, its reason for existence, and its greatest challenge. This sluggish waterway, with its 2 branches converging near the lake, provided the natural harbor that made the location valuable. But the river was problematic in almost every practical way. The river's mouth was perpetually blocked by sandbars. Lake currents deposited sand that made navigation difficult or impossible for larger vessels. Ships arriving on Lake Michigan often had to anchor offshore while their cargo was transferred to smaller boats that could navigate the shallow entrance. The federal government had made some improvements. A pier had been constructed in 1833 to help keep the channel open, but the battle against the sand was constant. The river itself was shallow, rarely more than a few feet deep in most places. It flowed, if flowed was even the right word for such a sluggish movement, through marshlands and prairies before emptying into the lake. During spring floods, the river might overflow its banks entirely. During dry spells, it could become too shallow for even small boats. Yet the river was essential. It provided the only route from the lake into the interior. It was the highway along which goods and people moved. The settlement clustered along its banks, and the most valuable real estate fronted the water. The commercial future of Chicago depended on improving this natural waterway and connecting it to the canal system that visionaries were already planning. The streets and buildings. The streets of 1835 Chicago were little more than surveyed lines through the mud. The town had been platted according to a grid pattern, with numbered streets and named avenues creating an orderly plan on paper. The reality on the ground was very different. Most streets were unpaved, simply bare earth that turned to deep mud after every rain. The famous Chicago mud was already legendary. Stories circulated about horses sinking to their bellies, about wagons being swallowed entirely, about men losing their boots in the mire. Some of these stories were exaggerated, others were not exaggerated enough. Crossing the main streets could be an adventure requiring planning and determination. The buildings were simple and functional. Most were constructed of wood, frame buildings thrown up quickly to shelter the arriving population. A few more substantial structures were being built of brick, but brick was expensive and had to be transported from considerable distances. The typical building was 1 or 2 stories, unpainted, and built for utility rather than appearance. The business district, such as it was, clustered near the river. General stores sold everything from tools to food to fabric. Taverns and boarding houses served the transient population. A few attorneys and land agents had established offices to handle the real estate transactions that seemed to occupy everyone's attention. The first newspaper, the Chicago Democrat, had begun publication in 1833 and was chronicling the town's rapid development. Fort Dearborn still stood at the mouth of the river, a reminder of the military presence that had protected American interests in this frontier region. The fort had been rebuilt after its destruction during the War of 1812, when the famous Fort Dearborn massacre had killed many of its garrison and civilian refugees. By 1835, the military importance of the fort was declining, and it would eventually be decommissioned, but its presence still shaped the settlement's geography and self-image. The lake and the harbor. Lake Michigan stretched to the eastern horizon, a vast freshwater sea that connected Chicago to the other Great Lakes and, ultimately, to the Atlantic Ocean via the St. Lawrence River. The lake was Chicago's lifeline, the route by which people and goods arrived from the east. The harbor, such as it was, consisted of the river mouth and whatever anchorage the lake provided. Ships arriving from Buffalo, Detroit, and other lake ports brought settlers, supplies, and news from the wider world. The shipping season ran from spring thaw to winter freeze, perhaps 7 months of the year. During winter, the lake was dangerous or impassable, and Chicago was largely cut off from water transportation. The lake also provided fish in abundance. Whitefish, trout, and other species were taken in quantities that would later seem unbelievable. Fishing was an important source of food for the settlement and beginning to become a commercial enterprise. The waters teemed with life, though systematic overfishing would later diminish these stocks. The lakefront was not the manicured park it would later become. It was a working waterfront, with wharves and warehouses crowding whatever space could be kept above water. The boundary between land and lake was often unclear. The marshes and mudflats extended the transition zone in ways that made shore a relative concept. The surrounding landscape. Beyond the immediate settlement, the landscape was prairie and marsh, vast, flat, and, to eastern eyes, almost featureless. The tall grass prairie stretched to the horizon in every direction except east, where the lake glittered. Occasional groves of trees, oak, hickory, maple, broke the prairie expanse, often marking waterways or slightly elevated ground. This was not empty wilderness, but recently dispossessed homeland. The Potawatomi and other native peoples had lived here for generations, and their traces remained visible. Trails, campsites, burial mounds. The Treaty of Chicago in 1833 had required them to leave within 3 years. In 1835, some Potawatomi still remained in the area, preparing for their forced removal westward. Their presence was a reminder of the violent dispossession that had made American settlement possible. The prairies supported abundant wildlife. Deer, wolves, and smaller game roamed the grasslands. Waterfowl filled the marshes during migrations. The bison that had once grazed these prairies were largely gone, pushed westward by settlement, but older residents could remember when they had been common. Chapter 2. The People. Pioneers, Speculators, and Survivors. A population of newcomers. Almost everyone in 1835 Chicago was from somewhere else. The population of approximately 3,500 had assembled in just a few years, drawn by the promise of opportunity in a new land. Native-born Chicagoans, people actually born in the settlement, were mostly children. The adults were immigrants, and their diverse origins shaped the community. The largest group came from the northeastern United States, New York, New England, and Pennsylvania. These Yankees brought commercial skills, capital, and a belief in improvement that would shape Chicago's development. They established businesses, speculated in land, and assumed leadership positions in the young community. Migrants from other parts of the United States, the Midwest, the Upper South, added to the population. Some were farmers seeking new land, others were craftsmen hoping to practice their trades, still others were simply adventurers drawn to the frontier. European immigrants were arriving in increasing numbers. The Irish, already fleeing poverty at home, were present as laborers and servants. Germans brought skilled trades and a strong work ethic. English, Scots, and others added their numbers to the mix. The population was remarkably young and predominantly male. This was a frontier, and frontiers attracted young men seeking opportunity. Women were present but outnumbered. Children were everywhere. Large families were the norm, and the population was reproducing as fast as it was arriving. The Native American presence. The Potawatomi had not yet entirely departed in 1835. The Treaty of Chicago, signed in 1833, had required them to cede their lands and remove westward within 3 years. But the process was gradual, and in 1835, some Potawatomi families still remained in the area, living in their traditional manner or working in the cash economy the Americans had brought. The relationship between settlers and Native Americans was complex. Some settlers had lived alongside Native peoples for years and maintained friendly relations. Others viewed them with suspicion or contempt. Trade continued. Furs, game, and other goods changed hands. But the fundamental reality was dispossession. The Potawatomi were being forced from lands they had occupied for generations to make way for American settlement. The final removal of the Potawatomi from northern Illinois would occur in 1836 and after. The Trail of Death, the forced march of Potawatomi to Kansas in 1838, would kill many and traumatize survivors. In 1835, this tragedy was still in the future, but its approach was unmistakable. The Native American era of Chicago's history was ending, violently and irreversibly. Speculators and dreamers. Land speculation was the dominant obsession of 1835 Chicago. Everyone, it seemed, was buying and selling land, or trying to. The belief that Chicago would become a great city meant that land purchased now would be worth fortunes later. This conviction drove speculation that approached mania. Land prices were rising rapidly. Lots that had sold for a few $100s in 1833 were changing hands for thousands in 1835. Everyone had a scheme, a tip, a sure thing. Stories circulated of fortunes made overnight by clever purchases. The frenzy would reach its peak in 1836 before the Panic of 1837 brought the speculation to a crashing halt. The speculators ranged from sophisticated Eastern investors to local opportunists to complete newcomers who had arrived with nothing but ambition. Some would indeed make fortunes. Many more would be ruined when the bubble burst. But in 1835, optimism reigned supreme, and anyone who suggested that prices might fall was dismissed as a fool. The working people. Not everyone in Chicago was speculating in land. Most residents were simply trying to make a living, working at the jobs that a frontier settlement required. Construction employed many workers. The constant building of houses, stores, and other structures created demand for carpenters, masons, and laborers. The workers were often recent arrivals themselves, earning wages to support families or to accumulate capital for their own ventures. The service trades occupied many others. Tavern keepers, boarding house operators, and others served the transient population. Blacksmiths, wheelwrights, and coopers practiced necessary crafts. Merchants sold goods to whoever could pay. Women's work was largely domestic but essential. Wives managed households under frontier conditions, cooking over open fires, making clothing, tending gardens, caring for children. Unmarried women might work as domestic servants in more prosperous households or take in sewing and laundry. Leaders and institutions. The young town was developing institutions and producing leaders. The first town election in 1833 had established a basic government. By 1835, the town had trustees, a president, equivalent to a mayor, and the beginning of municipal services. Several men were emerging as important figures. John Stephen Wright, who had become one of Chicago's greatest boosters, was already promoting the town's prospects. William Butler Ogden, who had become the first mayor when Chicago was incorporated as a city in 1837, was establishing himself. These and others like them combined business acumen with civic ambition. Churches were being organized. The First Presbyterian Church and First Baptist Church had been established. Methodist circuit riders served the scattered population. Religion provided not only spiritual comfort, but social organization in a community still taking shape. The Chicago Democrat newspaper, founded by John Calhoun in 1833, chronicled local events and boosted the town's prospects. A newspaper was an essential institution for any American community, providing news, advertising, and a public forum for debate. Chapter 3: Daily Life. Survival on the Frontier. The Rhythms of the Day. Life in 1835, Chicago followed rhythms dictated by nature, work, and survival. Without electric lighting, activities concentrated in daylight hours. Without central heating, winter imposed its own schedule. Without modern conveniences, every task required more time and effort than later generations could easily imagine. The day began early. Fires had to be lit for cooking, and, in cold weather, for heat. Water had to be hauled from wells or the river. Animals had to be tended. Breakfast was prepared and eaten before the day's main work began. These morning routines consumed considerable time and energy. Work filled the daylight hours. Men went to their occupations: construction, commerce, crafts, or labor. Women managed households, which was a full-time occupation in itself. Children helped with whatever tasks their age and strength permitted. Leisure in the modern sense was limited. Evening brought a brief period of rest before sleep. Families gathered around fires or candles, conversation, perhaps some reading for the literate, prayers in religious households. These were the entertainments available. Darkness came early in winter, and candles were expensive. Most people retired early and rose before dawn. Food and provisions. Food in 1835. Chicago came from a combination of local production, hunting and fishing, and imported provisions. The balance among these sources shifted with seasons and circumstances. Local agriculture was developing but limited. Some settlers had planted crops: corn, potatoes, vegetables, but the wet prairies were difficult to farm with available technology. Drainage and breaking the prairie sod required labor and equipment that many lacked. Hunting and fishing supplemented cultivated food. The prairies still held deer and smaller game. The lake and river provided fish. Waterfowl were abundant in season. These wild foods were important sources of protein. Imported provisions arrived by ship during the navigation season. Flour, salt pork, coffee, sugar, and other staples came from eastern ports. Prices were high due to transportation costs, and supplies could be uncertain. Winter, when shipping ceased, was the lean season. Cooking was done over open fires or on simple stoves. Bread baking, meat roasting, and the preparation of meals required skill and constant attention. Without refrigeration, food preservation depended on salting, smoking, and drying. Fresh food was seasonal. Preserved food sustained the winter months. Housing and shelter. Housing in 1835, Chicago was basic and often inadequate. The rapid growth of the population meant that construction could not keep pace with demand. Newcomers scrambled for shelter, sometimes crowding into whatever space they could find. The typical dwelling was a simple frame house, 1 or 2 rooms, constructed of lumber that had been shipped across the lake from Michigan forests. The prairie provided little timber, making lumber a valuable import. Construction was fast, but often crude, with gaps that admitted cold wind and summer insects. More established residents might occupy larger houses or houses built to higher standards. A few brick structures were being built, proclaiming their owners' success and permanence, but most housing was modest at best. The poorest residents lived in shanties, crude shelters of scrap lumber, tar paper, or whatever materials could be obtained. These offered minimal protection from the elements. Boarding houses accommodated single workers, sometimes packing many men into shared rooms. Heating depended on fireplaces or stoves, burning wood that had to be cut, transported, and stored. Keeping warm in winter required substantial effort and expense. The poor suffered from cold. Even the comfortable found winter challenging. Health and disease. Disease was a constant threat in 1835 Chicago. The combination of inadequate sanitation, contaminated water, swampy terrain, and crowded conditions created ideal circumstances for illness. Malaria, called ague, or the shakes, was endemic. The mosquitoes that bred in the marshes surrounding the town carried the disease, though the connection between mosquitoes and malaria was not understood. Victims suffered recurring cycles of chills and fever that could persist for years. The disease was rarely fatal, but chronically debilitating. A substantial portion of the population was affected. Typhoid fever, dysentery, and other waterborne diseases spread through contaminated water supplies. Wells were often too close to privies and other sources of contamination. The river, which served as both water source and sewer, was increasingly polluted. Cholera had not yet struck Chicago, but would arrive with devastating effect in 1850 and 1854. Other epidemic diseases remained threats. Childhood diseases killed many before adulthood. Life expectancy was short by modern standards. Medical care was primitive, physicians existed, but their training was often minimal and their treatments frequently harmful. Bleeding, purging, and toxic medicines like calomel were standard remedies. Many people relied on home remedies, patent medicines, or simply endurance. Transportation and communication. Getting to Chicago in 1835 required endurance and determination. There were no railroads. The first would not arrive until 1848. The options were water transportation or overland travel by horse, wagon, or on foot. Lake transportation was the primary route from the east. Steamships and sailing vessels connected Chicago to Buffalo, Detroit, and other lake ports. From Buffalo, passengers could travel by canal to Albany and then by rail or steamboat to eastern cities. The journey from New York to Chicago might take 2 weeks or more. Overland travel was slower and more difficult. Roads, where they existed, were often poor, rutted, muddy, and sometimes impassable. Stagecoaches operated on some routes. Many settlers traveled in their own wagons or simply walked. Within Chicago, transportation meant walking or riding horses. The streets were too poor for comfortable vehicle travel. The mud that made the streets infamous also made wheeled transportation difficult, except in the driest weather. Communication was similarly constrained. The Postal Service delivered mail, but delivery could take weeks from distant points. News traveled at the speed of ships and horses. The newspaper provided local information, but news from the wider world was always old by the time it arrived. Chapter 4: Commerce and Economy. The birth of a trading center. The economic foundation. Chicago's economy in 1835 rested on a simple foundation. The town was a transfer point, a place where goods changed hands and changed modes of transportation. The promise was that this function would grow as the region developed and as planned infrastructure connected the Great Lakes to the Mississippi River system. The immediate commerce involved supplying settlers and forwarding their products to eastern markets. Merchants stocked goods that pioneers needed: tools, hardware, cloth, provisions, and sold them at prices that reflected transportation costs and frontier scarcity. The same merchants bought what settlers had to sell: grain, furs, livestock, and arranged shipment eastward. The fur trade, which had been the region's original commercial activity, was declining but not yet dead. Beaver and other fur-bearing animals had been trapped out of the immediate area, but furs from further west still passed through Chicago. The American Fur Company maintained a presence, though its dominance was waning. The grain trade was growing in importance. Farms throughout Illinois and beyond produced wheat and corn that needed to reach eastern markets. Chicago was positioning itself as the collection and forwarding point for this agricultural production. The trade was still modest, but its potential was obvious. Land speculation. Land speculation dominated economic activity and conversation in 1835 Chicago. The belief that land values would rise, and rise dramatically, drove a frenzy of buying and selling that consumed the town's energy. The federal government had surveyed the public lands and made them available for purchase at $1.25 per acre. Speculators bought these lands, hoping to resell at higher prices to actual settlers or to other speculators. Land changed hands repeatedly, each transaction supposedly adding value. Town lots within Chicago itself commanded far higher prices. A lot that had sold for $100 in 1833 might sell for $1,000 or more in 1835. The appreciation seemed limitless. Stories circulated of ordinary men becoming wealthy through lucky land purchases. The speculation drew capital from the east. Investors who had never seen Chicago bought land based on maps and descriptions. Local agents represented distant principals, conducting transactions and collecting fees. Money flowed in, though much of it existed only as paper promises. The Illinois and Michigan Canal. The great project that would transform Chicago's economy was the Illinois and Michigan Canal, designed to connect Lake Michigan to the Illinois River and thus to the Mississippi. This canal would make real the geographic promise that had attracted attention to Chicago in the first place. The canal had been discussed for decades, and the route had been surveyed. In 1836, the year after our focus, construction would finally begin, but in 1835, the canal was still a plan, a promise, a cause for optimism. Its eventual completion in 1848 would vindicate the speculator's faith, but in 1835, that was still an uncertain future. The promise of the canal drove much of the speculation. Land along the proposed route was especially valuable. Towns that would become canal ports were being platted and promoted. The canal represented the infrastructure that would transform a frontier outpost into a major commercial center. Banking and currency. The financial system of 1835 Chicago was chaotic and unreliable. There was no national currency. What circulated was a confusing mixture of gold and silver coins, banknotes from various state banks, and promissory notes of uncertain value. Banknotes varied wildly in their reliability. Notes from well-established Eastern banks traded near face value. Notes from shaky frontier banks traded at discounts or were worthless. Determining the value of currency required expertise that many lacked. Credit was essential for commerce, but risky for all parties. Merchants extended credit to customers, accepting payment when crops were sold or other funds became available. Eastern suppliers extended credit to Western merchants. The chains of credit were long and fragile. The Panic of 1837, still 2 years in the future, would demonstrate just how fragile. Banks would fail, credit would evaporate, and land values would collapse. But in 1835, confidence remained high, and the system seemed to be working. Chapter 5: Governance, Law, and Social Order. The Town Government. Chicago had been incorporated as a town in 1833, establishing a basic governmental structure. The town meeting elected trustees who managed local affairs. A town president presided over the trustees and represented the community. The government's powers were limited and its resources minimal. It could regulate certain activities, maintain basic order, and undertake limited improvements, but it lacked the tax base and authority to address the settlement's growing needs. The debates in town meetings reflected frontier concerns. How should the streets be improved? How could the harbor be maintained? What regulations should apply to business? These practical questions occupied the government, which had little time or capacity for broader policy. The transition to city government was approaching. In 1837, Chicago would be incorporated as a city, with a mayor, city council, and expanded powers. But in 1835, the town structure still sufficed for a community that remained small enough for face-to-face governance. Law and order. Maintaining order in 1835 Chicago was challenging. The combination of a transient population, frontier conditions, alcohol, and limited law enforcement created opportunities for crime and disorder. The town had no professional police force. Constables and occasional volunteer efforts provided what law enforcement existed. For serious crimes, the county sheriff had jurisdiction. The state militia could theoretically be called upon, but it was poorly organized. The courts provided formal justice, but their reach was limited. Justices of the peace handled minor matters. The county court addressed more serious cases. Appeals went to state courts in distant locations. The legal system was present but rudimentary. Violence was not uncommon. Fights, sometimes involving weapons, settled disputes that might elsewhere go to court. The frontier ethic of self-reliance extended to self-defense. Men carried knives and sometimes guns. The line between acceptable force and criminal violence was often unclear. Property crimes reflected the opportunities and temptations of a boom town. Theft, fraud, and sharp dealing flourished in an environment where strangers constantly arrived. Transactions happened quickly, and tomorrow everyone might be gone. Social order and disorder. The social order of 1835 Chicago was still forming. The hierarchies that would later characterize the city were not yet firmly established. Wealth, when it existed, was often new and uncertain. Status could change with a single land transaction. The saloon was a central social institution for men. Here, deals were discussed, news was exchanged, and the serious drinking that characterized frontier life took place. Public drunkenness was common and generally tolerated. The temperance movement that would later influence American life was just beginning. Prostitution existed, though the settlement was perhaps too small to support the organized vice districts that would later develop. The shortage of women and the presence of many unattached men created demand that was met in various ways. Religion provided moral framework and social order for those who participated. Church membership indicated respectability and provided community, but many frontier settlers had minimal connection to organized religion, and the church's influence was limited. The military presence. Fort Dearborn still stood in 1835, though its importance was declining. The military presence that had established American control over the region was becoming less necessary as settlement proceeded and Native American resistance ended. The fort had been rebuilt after its destruction in the War of 1812. The massacre that had accompanied that destruction, when soldiers and civilians evacuating the fort were attacked by Potawatomi warriors, remained a living memory for some residents. The rebuilt fort was a symbol of American persistence and ultimate triumph. By 1835, the fort's garrison was small, and its military mission largely complete. The Potawatomi were being removed. No significant Native American threat remained. The fort would be decommissioned in 1836 and its land sold to private parties, but in 1835, it still anchored the settlement, a reminder of the military origins of American Chicago. Chapter 6: The Future Taking Shape. The Vision of Greatness. Even in 1835, when Chicago was a muddy frontier settlement of a few thousand people, some residents could see its potential for greatness. They understood the geography that made this location strategically important. They anticipated the infrastructure, the canal, the railroads, that would transform the frontier outpost into a major city. John Stephen Wright was perhaps the most articulate of these visionaries. Young, energetic, and relentlessly optimistic, Wright promoted Chicago's prospects through writing, speaking, and his own investments. His predictions of Chicago's future growth seemed absurd to skeptics, but history would vindicate him. Others shared the vision, investing their capital and their lives in Chicago's future. They bought land, built businesses, and worked to create the city they imagined. Their confidence attracted more settlers, more investment, more momentum. The expectation of greatness was itself a force for making it happen. The vision was not merely commercial. Some dreamers imagined Chicago as a center of culture, education, and moral improvement. Churches, schools, and civic institutions would transform the raw settlement into a civilized community. The vision of Chicago included not just wealth, but refinement. The Potawatomi departure. The removal of the Potawatomi people was the painful precondition for the Chicago the visionaries imagined. The Treaty of Chicago in 1833 had required the Potawatomi to cede their lands and remove westward within 3 years. In 1835, that deadline was approaching. Some Potawatomi had already departed. Others remained, completing their preparations, or hoping that somehow the removal might be avoided. Their presence in and around Chicago was a reminder of the violence that underlay American expansion. The final removal in 1835 and the years following would be brutal. The Trail of Death in 1838 would force hundreds of Potawatomi on a deadly march to Kansas. Disease, exhaustion, and despair would kill many. The survivors would be left in a strange land far from their homeland. In 1835, this tragedy was still unfolding. The American settlers who were building Chicago generally supported removal, viewing Native Americans as obstacles to progress. Few questioned the morality of dispossession. The dominant narrative celebrated American expansion without acknowledging its costs to Native peoples. What was coming? The years following 1835 would bring both triumph and disaster. The land speculation boom would peak in 1836 and then collapse in the panic of 1837. Banks would fail, fortunes would vanish, and the economy would struggle for years. Some of the confident speculators of 1835 would be ruined. But Chicago would survive and eventually thrive. The Illinois and Michigan Canal would be completed in 1848, vindicating the geographic optimism. The railroads would arrive, making Chicago the nation's railroad hub. The population would explode, reaching 100,000 by 1860 and continuing to grow. The city that would emerge from the muddy settlement of 1835 would become one of the world's great cities. The transformation would be so dramatic that visitors in later decades could barely believe descriptions of the early years. The mud, the fevers, the crude buildings, all would seem like legends from a distant past. The moment captured. Chicago in 1835 was a moment of becoming, a place transforming from wilderness to settlement to town, with the city still ahead. The Native American era was ending, violently and irreversibly. The American city was being born, painfully and chaotically. The future was uncertain but full of possibility. The people who lived through this moment, the speculators and laborers, the merchants and craftsmen, the women managing frontier households, the children growing up amid the mud and ambition, were participating in something they could only partially understand. They were building a city that did not yet exist, creating a future they could only imagine. Their Chicago was a place of extraordinary discomfort and extraordinary possibility. The mud that swallowed horses was also the foundation of fortunes. The fevers that weakened bodies coexisted with dreams that energized spirits. The tiny settlement of 1835 contained within it the seeds of the great city to come. What drove them, these pioneers who chose this difficult place and stuck with it through hardship, was a conviction that the future would be better than the present. They endured the mud, the disease, and the uncertainty because they believed that Chicago would become something magnificent. History would prove many of them right.